The idea behind the show is simply asking guests what they would tell a stranger on a plane if they were sitting next to them and the stranger asked them for advice.
The scenery is passing very fast, but the seer is constant. The one who's seeing is the same.
Let me appreciate you for asking a question that I haven't been asked after 2,500 or so interviews over the years.
Is you have to drop the ego, which is everyone's greatest obstacle.
2008, Grant and I had been married for 4 years. I was pregnant with my first child. The economy was collapsing, and we were on the verge of losing everything financially.
So I'm so excited to be here today with another new guest, this time Patty Aubery. And Patty, before we jump right in, I wanted to ask you, one of the things I was watching in preparing for this video, and I heard Jack say that, if I remember correctly, Jack Canfield saying that you were, I believe you were hired as his first secretary, I believe it was, or is that correct?
That is correct.
And look at you now. Wow. And so I love hearing that, because you don't hear that often enough, like somebody kind of working within and kind of building their way up. So often these days, it seems that people will just hire kind of the next person to replace the previous person. And so before I jump right in, can you tell me, I guess, what that did for you in terms of understanding the organization that you now find yourself running, being, working from probably every level of the company?
Sure. I mean, for starters, there was no organization really. So it was Jack teaching self-esteem in the classroom, and we didn't have anything else. And so I literally answered that ad after I'd gone to a weekend workshop that I was the first weekend workshop I'd ever gone to. It wasn't Jack's. And self-help was totally new to me. And they said, set a goal. And so I thought, all right, I'm going to set a goal to make $25,000 a year by December 31st, 1989. And I was making $14,000 a year at the time. I had no idea how. Like, don't worry about the how, just write it down. So I'm doing my affirmations, and I happened to be looking for a new job because I'd moved from Santa Barbara back to LA. And so I'm in the LA Times, because we didn't have an internet back then, and it says secretary wanted, and then huge, $25,000 a year. And I'm like, ugh, I don't want. I said to my dad, I'm never going to be a secretary. I don't even need to learn how to type. He's like, you do too. So anyway, long story short, I decided to call and see if I could get an interview. And I did. I didn't know who I was getting an interview with. I didn't know Jack from anybody. I went to his little tiny condo with, red shag carpet in Hippieville, and into a personal residence, which I don't recommend anybody ever do. You could get mugged. And so I went in, he's like, yeah, we did the self-esteem and the classroom stuff. I didn't know what self-esteem was. And so I did the interview. I left, and I thought, this is kind of weird. I don't really understand what they're doing. But then I met with a friend that night, and she said, oh, I know who this guy is. He's really cool. So of course I wanted the job, and then I didn't get it. He went with somebody that had more experience in the hotel industry. And I'm like, okay. And then he called me back a couple months later and said, hey, I really think we're supposed to work together. I don't know what it is, but you keep coming into my mind. And I said, all right, well, it's going to cost you 30. And he said, okay, why don't you come down and we'll have lunch? And I thought, wow, he's nice. He's easy. Maybe 30 will go to 300 and go to 3 million. I'm just going to think big. And so I did that, and I was his secretary. And then he left to go out of town for weeks because he was traveling a ton. And I looked at all the systems that he had that were terrible. His overheads were like an overhead projector with crayons. The printing was off. It was horrible. And so I thought, I'm just going to take this whole network, fire the guy that writes his code for 50 grand a year. And for 20, I can put in my own Mac network, and I can write all the code for accounting. And so I did it, and it came back. It's like, wow, I said, yeah, I saved 30,000. We have all this new stuff. And by the way, I want to be vice president of operations because I'm kind of running the show. And he's like, okay, make yourself some cards. So I was secretary for about 5 minutes, but if you don't ask, you don't get.
Wow. I love that. That's amazing. I mean, I'm glad I asked that, because I didn't expect that story to go anywhere near that direction. I just heard the first part of the story, and I thought I would ask about it. So I love that. So Patty, I'm going to jump from that question, which of course is kind of, an opening question to something that's a much bigger question. And it's around this idea of this term we talk about called legacy. Something that's been intriguing to me lately is I've noticed I've had kind of a divide between people answering this question around legacy, where some people say it's I decide it by every day what action I take. And then I've had other people say it's just what's going to happen when I'm gone, and other people will decide what legacy I created. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on it. Is this something that you try to create intentionally, or is it something that'll just ultimately happen to you, or it's what people say behind your back when you're not around?
All of the above. I think legacy is a huge conversation to have, and it should happen years prior to anybody ever thinking that they're going to retire or they're going to get too old. It's a conversation Jack and I have been having for the last 7 or 8 years. We actually created an online version of a certification to train trainers around the world to do the work that he does, based on that concept that we want to have a legacy. And we went from doing 60 trainers a year to having 5,000 trainers around the world, and people can start anytime they want. So it's a huge factor for us to make sure the work continues. And that takes planning. And a lot of people don't want to think about it because they don't want to think about being irrelevant or dead or whatever, incapacitated, whatever it might look like. But I think we owe it to not just ourselves, but to our families, our employees, and the rest of the people that do the work to have clarity around what that looks like. So I think it's a big topic and it's important.
So, and again, I didn't expect to go in this direction either, but I want to ask you, when I look, I've interviewed Jack a couple of times, and it's amazing to me, it's like he's just getting started, and he's not 20 anymore. And I mean, he started Chicken Soup, something that inspires me. If I have the dates correctly, I think he was like 40s, like late 40s, like 48 or something. Does that sound right? And so to me, that's already,
math. Let's see. Yeah, he's 78. I'm 47. So 21 years. I was 24. So he was 45 or 46 when we started the journey. It wasn't a smooth thing that happened overnight.
Yeah, and it could have been my thinking could have been when the book was released or when it was released with that publisher. But my question is, I'm curious, like, as you just mentioned, late 70s and still out there doing talks, still working with people, still sharing his legacy. Is it something that you think when somebody has found their purpose and their calling, they don't think of this word retirement as often? Because this is something I've noticed. So I'm just curious your take on it.
I completely think that's true. I mean, for him, teaching is his passion. And if he wasn't able to teach, I don't know what he'd be doing. I mean, people look at Chicken Soup as, oh, this great idea, but it really was Jack's unique ability to aggregate content. And he just started aggregating stories and started to listen to feedback. Like, is that story in a book? Is that story in a book? And that's how it all sort of spawned, by just listening to what people were saying. I don't listen to tapes. I'm a mom. I'm in and out of my minivan. I want to read these stories in a book. So we went on the journey to create that. And that took 3 years to do. But no, he'll never stop. I mean, sometimes I have to joke, like, am I going to have to just bury you under the living room floor and just make it like a museum, because there's so many relics. If you saw his office, you would see. But I think our why of what we do is what drives us and fuels us. And I don't think anything is scalable if you don't really consider what your purpose and your passion are.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and like I said, it's something I've noticed, that when I'm interviewing high achievers, it's wild to me that they don't, most of them that are in their perhaps early to late 70s, some in their 80s, don't seem like there's any sign of, I'm going to retire next year, or I'm ready to stop teaching this. I'm ready to stop helping people discover their purpose. I mean, and I guess the other side is, why would you? What is there to retire from if you love what you're doing? But it's just something I've noticed lately, especially like spending time with somebody like a Les Brown, or James Redfield. James looks the same age as he did in the back of the book cover when it came out in 93. The late Bob Proctor, a few years ago, sitting with him holding his book, Think and Grow Rich. I mean, he was still building his legacy in his mid 80s. And so it's something I've noticed, and I've been really curious about it, is we don't hear the word retirement at all. It seems, from people that are living on purpose.
Absolutely. I mean, some things change, we modify different things. It's not like he wants to do a 40 city tour right now. But we look at, all right, so how do we be as effective by doing it differently? And what would that look like if we could reach the same amount of people? So it's always a question. If it could work, what would it look like?
So my main question I want to ask you is a question that I call the passenger question. And it's as simple as this. If you were sitting on a plane, sitting next to a stranger, they leaned over, maybe they know you, maybe they don't, but they say, hey, I'm just starting my journey. I need some life advice. What do you got for me? My question out of that, Patty, is what do you think you might tell that person?
I would tell them that guilt is overrated and that the gift of life is really in being present, and that it's not about quantity of time spent with your family or your employees or whatever it is. It's the quality of time. I think a lot of young entrepreneurs that are starting out really struggle with, how do I get balance? And lots of times that's just not going to ever happen. I know with Chicken Soup, it was 18-hour days for years. But when I did spend time with my kids, it was good time. It was quality time. I was only doing the things that nobody else could do. And so I think that's a big deal for people to really look at being present and how do you stay present in those crazy moments. So that's probably what I would say. And I would say the fastest way to get to that space is to learn how to meditate.
I love that. It makes me think of when you talked about quality time. A couple of years ago, Tom Ziegler, I was interviewing him and at an event of his, and he was talking about his father, Zig, and how he said his father was, of course, back in the day, I mean, he was always on the road. So he was only home like maybe 20 days, 30 days a year. He said, but he was so present, he felt like he was home more than the guy who lived next door that came home every night.
Yeah.
Was very telling. Like he said, we felt like our father was always there. And meanwhile, when we look at it objectively now, he was hardly ever home. But yet, when he was home, he was home. So I love what you said there about quality. And so let me follow up. This is a second question that I've asked now thousands of times. I love asking this question because I love the different answers. I call it the time machine question. So this one, you can probably see where I'm going with this. But if you could jump into a time machine, go back and talk to a younger Patty. Obviously, the difference here from the passenger is that you're not talking to a stranger now. You're talking to a younger you, and you could give her some life advice. What do you think you might tell her? Would it be the same as the stranger on the plane, or would you give her different advice?
I would say ask for higher royalties sooner. I think for me, it would be show up sooner. I realized that I was so busy being the president of Chicken Soup for the Soul that I wasn't truly owning my own gifts and the things that I was doing really well. And I was a New York Times bestseller. I actually was 14-time New York Times bestseller, and I never really owned it. And so it wasn't until my mom died that she said, promise me that you will not be invisible. I did not raise a daughter to be invisible. You were here from the beginning, and it's time for you to show up and speak up and be seen. And so if I could dial back, I would have said yes to all those invitations to those stadiums of women, scared or not scared. But the only way to build the confidence is by doing. And I hid. I was a good hider because I knew business and I knew strategy. And, I stayed busy doing that. So I didn't have to get scared doing my uncomfortable. And I would say, be uncomfortable, because if you're not growing, you're not stretching.
So my last, I'll call it unofficial question, and then I'm just going to ask you the official question of where we can learn more, just to give you a heads up. But the unofficial question I want to ask you is about books. So I should never assume, but I can probably conclude that you're a book reader, being involved in Chicken Soup and what that all meant to so many readers in the world. So my question out of that is, when it comes to books, do you have a book that changed the game for you? Like, do you have a book that you tell everybody you need to check out this book?
It's so weird. There's one book. I mean, I've read 1,000 books and I don't know, 1,000,000 stories, but there's a book by Aubery called The Choice. It's a very simple book, and it was a game changer for me in the early years of my career. I highly recommend it.
I love that. I actually, I've read that book. I've read most of Aubery's books, and I only discovered him about 10 years ago, and I'm thankful I did. And I love the fact that all his books are so tiny. We did our own audiobook version of reading books to each other, my girlfriend and I, on a trip recently, where we just read Aubery, The Greatest Salesman of the World 1 and 2, because she hadn't read it. So big Aubery fan. Like I said, that was the last unofficial question, but I'm curious, Chicken Soup for the Soul, I've heard different numbers. Do you know the exact number of how many copies are sold now? Because I've heard a few different variations, and I'm just always curious which one the accurate one is.
Well, I know that before we sold the company in 2008, we had done 230 something titles. and we had sold about 300 million copies. And then we licensed the rights to the Chinese, and they used it to teach kids how to speak English. And so they printed another 200 million copies, so about 500 million. And since then, I'm going to say probably another 500,000 have sold, maybe 1 million since we sold the company in 2008.
Wow. Anyway, just blows my mind. It's staggering. So I just wanted to get it from the source. So I thought I would ask you. That's amazing. So Patty,
I read all your books. I'm like, you read all 240? Are you nuts? What's wrong with you? And they're like, oh my God, no.
Wait a minute. I didn't think there was that many. And yeah, it's just I'm sure that Jack and Mark, whenever they started that journey, even though they believed in it, I'm sure they probably, I don't know, they're big vision people, so maybe they did, but I don't know if they visioned 200 and some versions of that book being in the world. That's just wild. So Patty, my last question, like I said, this is the official one, but for people that heard this interview, it's very short, but they heard a lot in a short amount of time. And of course, they got introduced a little bit more to Jack Canfield and yourself and the brand that you guys have created. So my last question is, where would people go if they want to reach out and find out more about those trainers you mentioned that work within the brand, or if they want to find out more about how to hire Jack or go to one of the events or any of that stuff?
Just go to jackcanfield.com and you can look under events and trainings. And under that is something we have called Train the Trainer. If you want to get certified in the success principles and become part of our mission to have 1 million people around the world training this work to others. If you're interested if you're a woman and you want to work with me or come to one of my women's retreats or masterminds or learn how to be a better speaker, you can go to Patty Aubery, which is AUBERY.com. And there's things there too, but together we're better. So most of the things we do are together.